Thank you, and thank you, Jessica and Sarah, for joining us on this really important topic. Jessica Ladd, founder of Callisto, Sarah Kunst, a founder and an investor. Both of you, I think, have displayed tremendous courage over, the last year, and for you even longer than that, and have helped, catalyze a really important conversation that's happening not just in Silicon Valley, but across the country. So Jessica, I want to start with you because Callisto was born out of your personal experience. And so I'd love it if you could share that experience with us and what inspired you to do this.
Sure. Hi. So I was sexually assaulted in college, like far too many college students. And over a year after my assault, I decided I wanted to report. And I remember coming forward to my school and being very unsure if what happened to me even counted as assault, being very unsure if I would be believed or what would happen with my information once I came forward. And in that process of reporting, I felt doubted, and I felt out of control. And I remember having to relive and retell my experience to multiple people. I remember the police officer telling me that there's two sides to every story and handing me a brochure on couples counseling. And I ended up regretting reporting. And I found the process of reporting my assault to be more traumatic than the assault. So if I have flashbacks, if I have panic attacks, it's not about sexual assault. It's actually about feeling doubted for one's own assault. And that's what really inspired me to start Callisto. It was, how do we take this process of coming forward and disclosing one of these experiences and not having it be something that takes away your sense of power and control all over again? How do we have this instead be an empowering act that gives you back a sense of agency when you're trying to protect your community?
So how does Callisto work?
So right now, we're partnering with college campuses. And each college campus we partner with, we give them a school-specific Callisto website. So if you're a Stanford student, you could go to stanford.callistocampus.org. You could learn about your reporting options that are specific to that institution. And you could take one of 3 actions related to reporting your assault. You could either just save what happened to you timestamped, doesn't have to go anywhere if you don't want it to, and we ask a series of questions about your incident designed to prompt for the most accurate information possible while triggering you as little as possible. 2, you can report electronically directly to your institution if you want to start an investigation, and then we give you really clear information about what's going to happen if you come forward. Or 3, you can say, I just want to save it for now, but I do want to come forward if somebody else names the same assailant. So we help find serial offenders. And for victims who, for whatever reason, don't want to come forward unless there's another victim, we help connect them so that they can report at the same time. And it's been working really well on college campuses. Survivors who use our system are 5 times more likely to report, and they report 3 times faster, which makes it much easier to do an investigation. And we found serial offenders that otherwise would not have been ever reported. And if they had, there would have only been 1 allegation, which makes it harder for the school to do an investigation.
Now, Sarah, before we talk about your experience and why you're on this stage, I want to know a little bit more about you and how you came to the tech industry, because I think that's been somewhat lost in the coverage. You have an amazing bio.
I feel like I've spent my entire life in the tech industry at this point, or at least my entire career. I started in college. I worked for Apple. I was at a campus that you're hopefully on, Michigan State University, and I started working in tech and met people who went on to work at Facebook and all these places, and I was watching them going, oh, I could do that. And I moved to New York and kind of was off and running in the tech world, building early stage companies, usually the first product or biz dev hire. And so, that was awesome. I got recruited into venture capital, was doing that at More David Howe Ventures. And I'll kind of roll it into the next question. I left there. I was looking for my next role. Everyone's like, you should go talk to Dave McClure at 500 Startups. He really loves helping women and minorities. And let me tell you, I had no idea how personal he wanted to make that help. So, went there, was talking to him about applying for a job. Everything was fine. And then he starts messaging me, telling me, I just don't know if I should hire you or hit on you. I can't control myself around you, like all this crazy stuff. And I was like, you're old and married, so maybe you should just hire me. But unfortunately, when you turn someone down like that, they tend to not hire you. Fast forward a few years, and I got a call from the New York Times saying, hey, we heard that Dave McClure, sexually harassed you, is propositioning you in return for a job, and we've heard similar things from other women, so I came forward.
How did you make that decision to come forward, and what were you weighing?
Honestly, I'm really impulsive. I liked the reporter. And we were talking about how this is crazy. We were talking about how she knew Elliot Stabler's wife from Law & Order SVU, and I was like, this is a sign. We're sitting in New York, we're talking about Law & Order SVU. Marissa Hargitay is like my spirit animal. I'm going to do it.
Katie Benner, by the way. She's fabulous. We all like Katie Benner at the New York Times.
Yes. I mean, if you're going to take anything from this, follow her instructions for how to come forward, not mine. It worked out, and that's great. And the interesting thing about all these women that I know who've come forward against really powerful men is it turns out that all of us little Davids are way more powerful than all those Goliaths. And so it works, but definitely think it through more than I did. I just kind of did it.
Well, and by the way, you came forward, and then after that, there was a whole chain of events that happened. So, Dave apologized. He wasn't going to quite resign.
Well, it turned out that he'd been sexually assaulting women, including his employees, for a very long time, and that they were paying out settlements to cover it up. And then all of a sudden, he left. So weird how that works.
The 500 Startups said in a statement that, in late 2016, the management team was made aware of inappropriate comments that Dave had made to a potential investment team candidate prior to her entering a formal interview process back in 2014.
It was actually during the interview process.
That was you.
Whatever.
At the time, we believe we addressed it appropriately with Dave. In April of this year, we were informed of an incident involving Dave and an employee. Upon investigation, we felt we needed to take significant action. In the midst of all this, another woman came forward named Cheryl Yo, who shared in great detail an incident that she had with Dave, and he has since left the company. Were you at all fearful or nervous, or in coming forward and putting your name out there? Or did you just not think about it too much, and that's how it happened?
Just kind of did it. And then I randomly had a friend's birthday in Jamaica that weekend, and so I fact check with the New York Times. I get on the plane, I'm in Jamaica, the news hits, I wake up from a nap, and the news had hit, and my phone is blowing up, and I literally am sitting on the bathroom floor in Jamaica, calling Ellen Powell, being like, what did I just do to my life? And she's like, oh yeah, there's that part of it. Oh yeah, there's that part of it. But then honestly, it was fine. And I think that there are moments where it's not so fine. And, I spent $2,500 at therapy the other month, whatever, right? It ebbs and flows. But honestly, that's at $200 an hour, guys. It was a rough month. But, honestly, I think that the truth wins out. I think that, the one thing that I had that I'm incredibly grateful for in this situation that made it different than a lot of kind of maybe more sensitive situations is that what happened to me was really, it was bad for my career. It derailed me. I should have been a shoo-in candidate for that role, did not get it. They went on to say things about me internally and in the media that I don't feel are accurate, all this stuff. It was really hard for me personally. Anybody who I date, whoever I marry, their grandparents will Google me. I don't know if grandparents Google, but their grandparents will know about this, right? So there's a level of exposure, but it's different when it's somebody who's sending you inappropriate, technically illegal text versus a sexual assault. And so I think that one reason why will always be so glad I came forward is that he was sexually assaulting other women. And, I didn't know that at the time. I just knew that he had this creepy reputation. But I'm so happy that I came forward because my story, as hard as it has been sometimes for me, I think it's easier to have those details out there. I can't imagine what it's like to have details of a graphic rape out there in that same way.
And, by the way, over the last year, I can say that my inbox is full of tips and full of stories. And so many stories will never get told because as a journalist, it involves months and months of reporting just to get one story out. And so, it's certainly very helpful when a woman is willing to go on the record with their name like you were. But there are a lot of complicated machinations happening behind the scenes in order to decide whether or not and how to tell these stories. Obviously, we know sexual assault and sexual harassment spans industries. It happens everywhere, from Silicon Valley to Washington to Hollywood to college campuses. And I'm curious what you think about the tech industry in particular that makes it, that has whether it has a sort of a unique brand of it here in terms of simply the way that business gets done and the fact that so much business happens outside the office. Jessica, I'll start with you since, you are also an entrepreneur.
Well, I think 92% of investors are men, venture capitalists, and 98% of the money goes to male-run companies. So, yeah, I would say that's unique in some ways. So it is a very, very male-dominated industry, particularly when you're talking about venture capital, but also we know engineering teams at tech companies, leadership of tech companies, very male-dominated. I also think that when you're looking at, for example, founders who are experiencing this problem with venture capitalists, right, then you're not just risking your own reputation and your life and having to become the face of this and all of this other stuff. You're also risking the well-being of your company. So I think the barriers are really high. You might have a little bit more power or network or privilege than some others, but you're also risking the well-being of your employees. And so I think that can create a unique type of challenge in coming forward.
Sarah, what do you think? I mean, given, I believe, one of the instances with Dave happened in like a sort of networking event that was like outside the office, but it was official, right? It was an official 500 Startups event.
Yeah, I mean, I spent the majority of my early career in New York, and I used to work for a kind of like nightlife digital media website. So literally my job was to go out and party. And with nightclub guys, with tech guys in New York, I never had those problems there. And so as much as it's systemic in the entire culture, and certainly there are lots and lots and lots of problems in nightclubs and in New York in general, there is, I think, something in the Silicon Valley tech culture where you haven't seen these kinds of eruptions, even in my inbox, and I'm sure your inbox is, when you get tips, the majority of them are about the Bay Area guys. It's not about the New York guys and the LA guys and the Austin guys. And even though there's guys in all those places and they're not funding women at a higher rate, they're not hiring women at a higher rate, they're not necessarily less biased against women. They just somehow manage to keep it in their pants at meetings. And so for whatever that is, like, thank you, men of not Silicon Valley. And so I think that, like, some of it is something that is maybe a little bit unique to Silicon Valley, where there's Patty Stanger. As you can tell, I consume a lot of pop culture. Patty Stanger, the millionaire matchmaker, calls it nasty nerds, right? This idea that you were like the nerd in high school and nobody liked you, and now you're going to get yours, and you're going to get it by any means necessary, and the world owes you. And I don't know if that's it, but for the life of me, like, I don't have a better answer for why tech. Yes, they're billionaires. Yes, they're all these things. But, we've all been in rooms with people of other industries who are also super successful. And it's not that same I don't feel internally, I don't feel that same constant, are you going to ignore me or hit on me, that I feel still almost constantly in
You
the Bay
still
Area.
feel that?
There's still a lot of it, right? Mm-hmm. Or they look at my name tag and they realize who I am, and then there's like a quick hard left, and I'm like, goodbye, friend. So it depends. But I do think that there's something uniquely toxic in the water here, and I think it's relatively systemic because the venture capitalists behave a certain way, and they fund founders who behave a certain way, who hire employees who behave a certain way, and then the women who are generally able to kind of maneuver through that stuff are somehow coated in Teflon, right? So a lot of the women that you'll see who are able to go on and raise a lot of money and do things like that, they have a really close connection to a man in tech who's powerful enough that no one bothers them. One thing that was really interesting about the Dave stuff is I'd known Dave for years, but I was at this big venture fund and I'd worked for a 500 startups company that he was close to the CEO of, so I never had any problems with him. It was literally, I think, the first time I'd ever seen him when I wasn't working for a big, powerful company or for one of his friends, and like, he had been waiting for that opportunity. It was pretty clear. And so it's just so fascinating to see all of these different little pieces of the way that it works in Silicon Valley. And I do think it's kind of a culture-wide problem here.
So let's talk a little bit about solutions and what, as a woman, you would have wanted as a solution. I mean, is that something that you would have reported to something like Callisto when that happened?
Yeah, so
in the moment.
I think that the amazing thing about Callisto and a lot of these tools that exist is that you just don't know what to do, right? I didn't know that I could have picked up the phone or Googled, sexual harassment lawyers, called any lawyer or sent them an email, been like, here's what happened. They would have gotten on the phone with me. They would have been like, oh my God, this is the easiest case I'll deal with all year. Just an FYI, if you're sexually harassed in a work environment, the EEOC, the Office of Equal Opportunity Employment, considers sexual harassment a workplace violation. So you have in California and New York 3 years to report it. You report it to them. They send you a letter that gives you the right to sue, and then you sue. And then, life kind of goes on. If you're past that 3-year statute of limitations, there's essentially nothing you can do. If you're in the rest of the US, it's about a year, if you're not in New York and California. I didn't know any of those things. They're not hard things to find out, but you kind of are in this holding pattern of like, it's all so weird and you want to pretend like it's not that bad and like maybe it wasn't that big of a deal and I don't know what to do and you're scared and like literally you're in such a fear spiral that you can't just Google like, how do I take that guy down, And if you do, you find stuff like Callisto and you find resources that can help you.
Talk to us a little bit more about how Callisto works. Like, do you filter the complaints? How do you vet them?
So there's how it works on college campuses, and then it's how it's going to work this summer, fingers crossed, when we expand. On college campuses, we send reports to the university, and they do the investigation. We only allow students with sort of that school email address to report. And if they want to make a report, they have to verify their email address, their identity, and send that in sort of along with their report. So we don't actually allow anonymous accusations because it makes it very hard for the investigator to do anything with that anonymous data. But if you just want to save what happened to you, it's completely anonymous. We don't need to know who you are at that point. But then we really leave it up to the university to take it from there, and we just by default believe our users. As we expand into these new sectors, it becomes a lot more complicated. Like, how do you verify identity? Where do you put reports to? Often it's very unclear where to go. You aren't within the same company as your assailant or harasser. And even if you are, you don't necessarily believe that that company will act in the best interest of the truth or the victim. So what we would like to do is build out a new system where victims get put in touch with somebody on our team who'll be an attorney who would have privilege, who could then help them figure out what to do next and what their options are, which are very different depending on the industry, depending on the case, depending on where it happened, depending on the state of jurisdiction, the employer, et cetera, and really help them navigate those different options and, as appropriate, put victims in touch with each other when they're trying to decide what to do to come forward. There's
been talk about developing some sort of like third-party HR type organization that would govern relationships between VCs and entrepreneurs, which happen outside, the four walls of the office and in this very gray area. Like, do you think that's a good idea? Do you think that cedes control to this sort of strange body?
It's hard, right? Because who funds it? Because entrepreneurs don't have money. That's why they're going and putting up with sexual harassment to get money. So realistically, then the VCs fund it. And so if something's super third party, but I'm funding it, that's not actually that third party, right? So I think that in venture very specifically, there aren't that many VCs. It feels like there are a lot, but there's actually not that many. And almost all of them, and I'm sure your inboxes have been the same as mine, every time a new name pops up in the news, you have 50 other people being like, finally, that guy, right? So these are very open secrets. And so sometimes I worry, Callisto, that's amazing. You need that, especially on college campuses, especially if you're, a kind of a number in a crowd at a massive company. But for VCs, there just aren't that many of them. And I think that...
But they have outsized influence
they have
on the companies that get funded.
Yes.
Who gets to invent the future,
And I think that I honestly believe that VCs are really... that the path forward there, it is effective to go to their funds, especially if you have proof. And it's really effective to go to the media. I know of at least several cases where a VC sexually harassed someone. Reporters find out, they call, the guy's fired. They don't do the story because horse trading exists, but it there is still a flywheel, and I think VC shops are increasingly being like, wait, we don't actually want this in our midst, and we're seeing very high profile founders of funds pushed out. So I'm not opposed to a third-party reporting system. It's just the time and effort it takes to build it, and who funds it, and how is it truly effective? How do you find totally neutral people to run it? If anything, I would say pool money from the VCs and give it to something like Callisto, because what do you do if you're a senior HR exec who gets hired to run this? You basically are going to burn a bunch of bridges, and you can never have another job in your life. Not to scare you about what you've done,
I
or
agree.
me about what I've done, but it's true.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think that in our mind, we're trying to separate out sort of the reporting from the investigation and saying, look, when you first disclose to somebody, ideally that's to someone who believes you and can help you figure out what do you want to do, right? And then when you're getting investigated, that has to be somebody who ideally is neutral. But if they're funded by the VCs, they're not neutral. And so I think that's my problem with a third-party HR. I don't really believe it.
So let's talk about another option, which is going to the media, going public. And as I said earlier, these stories are incredibly difficult to tell, especially when women, don't want to go on the record. And, on my book tour, I've been asked over and over again, like, what should I do if this happens to me? Should I go public? And it's such a hard question to answer because every case is so individual, and you never know what the impact is going to be. I mean, when The Information published that story on Justin Caldbeck, there was that sort of 8 hours of silence where no one said anything on Twitter.
It's crazy because everyone in tech knew that Justin Caldbeck was doing this stuff. Like, everyone in tech knew it. It was the biggest, nobody knew what companies he was invested in because he wasn't a particularly spectacular investor. Everyone knew if you said his name that you were talking about sexual harassment.
I will say that, when I started writing my book, it was a year before that story came out that I started looking into Justin Caldbeck's behavior. So I would agree, in some circles, it was sort of an open secret. And The Information really sort of set the standard for, how we report these stories, what we need, in order to get them over the line and get them published. But I'm sure you know that behind the scenes, there was a ton of work going on among the victims, hours and hours of work to sort of convince and support each other and get them over the line. Ninian Wang, another entrepreneur, she really worked really hard to get that story published. But, what is your advice to women? Should they go to the media? And we've seen, by the way, a wide range of claims, which I want to talk about, Harvey Weinstein to Aziz Ansari. What is the right path for a woman who's had a bad experience, a horrific experience?
Yeah, I think that I think it's so important, if something happened to you 3 years ago, if something happened to you 3 minutes ago, immediately document it, right? Kind of like the anonymous piece of that. Document it, email it to yourself, send a timestamp. If you had something that happened to you years ago and you know that you recounted it to somebody else, go collect that, as in the words of the late, great Whitney Houston, right? Show me the receipts. So you want to make sure that you keep the data trail, because there's usually at this point, in our digital lives, a data trail. So keep that. And you don't really have to do anything with it, but have it and keep it, and keep it really safe. And if something happened to you recently, go tell somebody. And I tell people this all the time, that person, that guy you were dating at the time and somebody sexually harassed you, send them a weird email, be like, hey, this is kind of weird. Will you email yourself? I don't even need to see it, everything that you recall me telling you, because that starts to put a timestamp on it to say, oh, on this day at this time, I had I told somebody about this. So then if your accuser 5 years later is a billionaire and then you're suing him, people can't say, oh, she's making this up now for money, right? 3% of all violent crime reports are fake. That includes sexual assault, which means that you can pick 3 people out of every 100 that you believe if they're falsely accused. That includes your dad. That includes, I would say the president, but I think we'd believe that. That includes your husband, right? So pick 3 guys, but then when the 4th guy gets accused, you have to swap that out because that's how numbers work. So I think it's really important to document and believe people. But in terms of coming forward, women come to me all the time and say, should I come forward? My background, I've spent a lot of time in media. I run a media company. So as much as I'm weirdly I don't know, I just stumbled into it. I was on the phone with my best friend who is a CNN reporter and asking her, hey, should I do this? And what should I think about, right? And I gave Katie the whole story, but I had the screenshots. I showed her. I didn't email her screenshots until the last possible minute that legal needed them to run the story until I'd already known what 500 was going to say in return. So I'm kind of like flippant about it in a way because like it all worked out and whatever, but I also had a decade and a half's worth of media training going into it to know what to do. Women come to me all the time with far more egregious stories and tons of proof, and I tell them, look, I think that you can absolutely drop a dime on this guy. I don't know if you want to. The way you're talking about it, I don't think you're ready to do this. I don't know if you want to do this, and you need to take care of yourself. And so that's a huge part of it. However, especially when you have somebody, people don't just, it's not like getting pregnant, right? It's not something that just happens once, right? Like these guys are not just doing it once. You're never the only victim. You're never the first victim. You're rarely ever going to be the worst victim, right? So there's going to be a trail. I've found that just asking questions, especially in this era, I spent years, honestly, asking people, have you ever heard anything weird about Dave McClure? And they would say no. And the reason why I eventually found out is he mainly would target women who were in other countries or who were very young or who were black, and in an amazing bit of intersectionality, there were so few black women in tech that it took me forever to find somebody who'd talked to another black woman who'd been sexually harassed by Dave McClure. And I was like, okay, this is wild on so many levels. But there's gonna be more victims out there. So think about how you would feel, like Google my name, right? Google Susan Fowler, Google some of these people's, Google Ellen Pao, although that's an extreme case of smearing that I don't think would happen today. And think about like, how do I feel if that's my name, right? When you Google me, one of my image search results is on a white supremacist website that was happy that Dave was taken down because in their words, he was a race mixer wannabe. And so they felt like he got his due, like his due, you know? Like, okay. You know, and then they were like, do you think she's a man? And I was like, hey, I'm not, but it could be, you know? So it's a weird, weird world once you come forward. And that's like when you can handle it emotionally. If you can't, or if it's going to be like traumatic for your career or your life, then like don't do it. Like these guys have already taken so much from us. We don't need to like sacrifice our careers, right? Pick up the phone, call reporters. One thing I will say, the most powerful words you can say to a reporter are off the record, right? Reach out to a reporter, say, I want to talk to you off the record. Please let me know if that's okay. Everything will be off the record unless I tell you otherwise. They're going to respond back and if they're interested and say, okay. And then you'll get on the phone with them. You'll tell them, you can sometimes just tell them a name, right? And they're going to be like, oh yeah, that guy. We got a lot on that guy. And you can decide then, do I want to, you know, you can let them know, look, if you ever move forward with a story on him, maybe I would give you something on background where you don't use my name. Maybe I'll give you other victims' names. Maybe I'll give you a place to look. Like there's a whole world of things you can do that aren't your face, you know, on the cover of a news story, being the lone person to name some guy.
Jessica, what do you think women should do? What's your advice?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right in that there's not a rule here, and that coming forward has a lot of different risks to it. There's reputational risks. There's also, I think, at least 7 of the women who accused Bill Cosby have now been sued by him. So it doesn't just somehow end when you go public, even if you can get the story published.
What about coming forward just to your boss or to HR at a company, which, as we know, also has its own risks associated with it?
I think it depends. I think everything, unfortunately, has a risk to it. And then it's just figuring out, is that worth it? Mm-hmm. A lot of people, if they're reporting to HR, kind of throw it as a grenade when they walk out the door. They already know that they want to leave. They say it at the end so that there's not a repercussion. But that's
I also think a lot of it is what you want, right? Like when you're like sitting there and you're like pissed off because this person's taking something from you, and you're thinking about, what do I want from them, right? Is it an apology? Is it for them to not work at this company anymore? Is it just for people to know internally? Is it for people to know externally? Like think about what it is and then really like go after that goal, right? Because a lot of times when you report in the workplace, they might get pushed out the door. They might have huge repercussions internally, and it is deeply unlikely anyone will ever know externally.
Let's talk about that because, you know, as we've said, there's sort of a range of transgressions that have been happening and that have been reported on, and we've already seen some of these people try to start their second act. So whether it's Justin, you know, trying to do a slideshow presentation about bro culture or speak at a conference, or, you know, I know Dave is tweeting and posting on Facebook. they have apologized. Justin's apologized many times. There's other investors who, an investor that I reported on who never apologized and denied the allegations completely, and he's also tweeting. At what point can we forgive? Do we ever forgive? At what point is the second act okay? There's people that have already gotten funding again who have been accused of really bad things.
I think it depends. To me, a lot of it depends. I personally don't believe, I call it a judgment issue a lot, right? So you can argue that one of two things happened with the Justin Caldbacks and Dave McClures of the world. They've admitted to sexual assault, but you can say that one of two things happened, right? They either were people who are doing things that are illegal and disgusting and not acceptable to do to women or anyone, and that's a problem. Or they're people with incredibly bad judgment. They're venture capitalists. VCs have an insanely easy life. All you do is sit in your office, drink coffee, eat the salad that your assistant brings you every day at lunch, and make judgment calls. So if your judgment is so bad that you think it's okay to tell somebody who's actively in an interview process with you when you're married, hey, I don't know if I should hire you or hit on you, who here thinks that's a good judgment, right? Say it's not illegal, say it's totally okay, although the government says otherwise, that's still a bad judgment call. So if your job is to make judgment calls and you're a bad judge, then you can't do your job. If I'm blind, I'm probably not going to be an airplane pilot, So I think that, to me, that there's that piece of it. And people talk about ruining these men's careers. I had a lot of Bitcoin. I had to sell all my Bitcoin because I wasn't getting hired by 500. I wasn't getting hired by anybody. I was okay, well, if I'm going to be out of work for a few months, what am I going to pay for stuff with? That's a real opportunity cost to me. What about my career? What about my money? What about my life? And why is that less valuable than Dave McClure's ability to sexually harass me? And I just personally don't believe it is. That being said, Dave's getting on planes and he's flying to Dubai and he's doing talks there. I'm sure he's raising money there and doing stuff with Bitcoin there, which is what's been shown on social media. So apparently he has a second act. He just has to get on a longer plane ride to do it. That's capitalism. We're here to be venture capitalists and be in tech. It's not our fault that the market says, hey, we don't like your behavior. And then in terms of the Justin Caldbacks of the world, Justin was doing this thing, and there's a great Wired article about it, where he was, on one hand, sending his victims cease and desist, saying, don't you dare talk about what I did to you and admitted I did to you. And then on the other hand, was sending women, including me, these long copy and paste emails about how sorry he was. Basically, anytime if his name came up in a tweet by a prominent woman in tech, he would send us these copy and paste emails asking to meet with us. And so, do I believe that anyone in the world is eligible for forgiveness? Yes. One of my friends spent 16 years in solitary confinement for murder, right? I believe in redemption. The difference is he's actually devoted his life to changing, and he hasn't murdered anyone else, and Justin Caldback is still harassing his victims.
So this brings me to my last question, which is tech in so many ways can be used for good and can be used for bad. And as we've seen with this movement, has been, Twitter as a tool for justice, but also, a way to, harass people and make their lives miserable. And so, obviously Callisto is a tech solution. What are the ways that you think tech itself can help us be better without holding us back?
So I think what's great about tech in a lot of ways is that you can access information that's otherwise hard to access or highly stigmatized. You can find other people to connect with that have had similar experiences. And you can be smart about anonymity in all of that. And I think that it can serve a much better role in response, the amount of work that you have to go through to figure out who to go to with your story or what to prepare or what to say. It's so much. We put so much burden on the victim, and just putting in, which is the least sexy answer, but high quality information online about what to do and what your options are, depending on the situation, I think can be extremely, extremely valuable. And I think that you can create real accountabilities and you can create a real deterrent. I think it's hard to do good prevention through tech, honestly. I think at the end of the day, we need to say, look, if we don't actually hold people accountable one way or the other for these actions, then we as a society are saying that this is acceptable. And no amount of online webinars or like click-through sexual harassment trainings are going to change that. And if we want to change it, we have to create real consequences. And if we want to have effective prevention strategies, they have to probably be long, in-person, norming with your peers, running through scenarios. And even then, it's only going to work on some people.
The Me Too movement. Is there going to be more? Are there going to be more stories? Are there going to be more stories?
There's so many stories. Like, I mean, raise your hand if you have a story, right? Like, everybody has a story. And it's you know, there's always going to be more, and I think that we need to like hold space to listen. I think especially for guys, it can be overwhelming because you're like, wait, this was all happening and you didn't tell me? And it's like, yeah, dude, and like, I'm sorry if this comes as a shock to you, but like, how privileged are you that this comes as a shock to you?
I do think at this point, ignorance can only be willful. Like, you know, I've written 300 pages about this.
Yes,
like, we know that this is a problem now.
Yes.
We can't say we didn't know.
Exactly.
All right, Jessica Ladd, Sarah Kunst, thank you so much for joining us. I'm sorry I used all the time. We don't have time for questions. Thank you so much for everything that you have done to help women.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.